Hello everyone, this is Miss Smith, and in this video we're going to talk about preparing correspondence and specifically about letters. Let's get started. And so in our textbook, it begins by talking about letters in the age of the internet. And we may tend to think that since we live in such an electronic world where communication happens so instantly, that there may not be a place any longer for the traditional letter, one that is typed and printed and then mailed to the recipient. But despite the dominance of internet communication, letters are still used heavily in the workplace. And so a letter can represent a company's public image and your competence as the writer of the letter. Letters tend to be far more formal in tone and structure than any type of business communication. Letters constitute an official legal record of agreement, and letters are the official and expected medium through which important documents and confidential documents are sent to readers in most cases. And so when we say that letters represents a company's public image, you may notice in your textbook on page 100 that there's an example of a letter there, and in that letter it has something at the top called a letterhead. And companies a lot of times will have their logo and some type of a graphic design of their image on the tops of their letter correspondence. And that's what we would consider to be a letterhead. And letterheads typically include your company's name, again that logo, and then the full company contact information, an address, a website address, maybe an email address. And so in that way, a letter can still carry that company's public image. And like we said before, letters can constitute an official legal record of agreement. Let me give you an example. So let's say that you've been hired for a job. It's conventional wisdom to wait until you have an offer letter in hand before you tell your current job that you're leaving, right? Because an offer letter would require that you sign it and agree to your salary and agree to your start date and a few other things. So that could be something that could be considered contractual almost. Legal. Sometimes those offer letters say that this is not a legal agreement. Sometimes they have that wording in there, but a lot of times it is assumed that if you have signed that letter that it's official that you intend to join that company and they intend to hire you. Okay, so letters tend to be a little bit more formal than a lot of the e-communication that we see nowadays. And so let's talk about letter formats. It's important that we understand the different types of formats for letters, but I will tell you up front that there is one format that we will use in my class, and you want to make sure that you're only using this particular one, and that is the full block format letter. Okay, but there are various types. The book talks about three of them: full block format, modified block format, and then semi-block format. And I have the coordinating page numbers here that go with your textbook that you can look at while I'm talking with you about it. So with full block format, and that begins on page 99, all of the information is flush against the left margin, and you want to double space in between sections of your letter. Okay, now don't confuse the two because your letter should be single spaced within those sections. However, you want to double space between sections. And so if you would, go ahead and turn to page 100 of your textbook and you'll see an example of a full block letter, and it also shows you how a full block letter should be spaced. And so in the example in your textbook, you see where it says April 7th, 2014. That's our date line, and we'll look at different parts of the letter in a moment, but that's your date line. And then you have two spaces after that before you move into the next section of the letter, which is the inside address. You'll notice that that section, Miss Molly Garopoulos, Business Manager, Myers Incorporated, that entire section there, that is all single spaced. Okay, that's what I mean. The sections are single spaced. You'll notice that each of the paragraphs are single spaced. But in between those sections, you want to make sure that you put two spaces. Now, I will point out something else. We probably will revisit this in a moment, but since you're on page 100 now, where it says sincerely yours near the bottom of the letter, that's the complimentary close. And you'll notice that instead of 2 spaces, this time it says 4 spaces. You want to remember to put 4 spaces between your complimentary close and your typed name. And so in our example, it reads, sincerely yours, then there are 4 spaces, and then the typed name is Carmen Trudeau, President. Okay, and so we'll go back to talking about that in a moment. But what you want to know is that in a full block format, everything is aligned to the left margin. You do not indent your paragraphs in a full block format. Okay, every single thing is flush to the left margin. And this is why I like using full block format. There's nothing to remember, right? You just have to make sure that everything is on that left margin. It's the easiest of the 3 that we have here, and that's why I like to use it. It's also widely used and widely accepted in the business world. And so make a note that on page 100, it will give you a spacing guideline for how a full block format letter should be written, how it should be organized on your page. Okay, and so there's also an example of a full block letter on page 103, and it has the different parts of the letter labeled, right? Like I said, we'll talk about parts of a letter in a moment. With a modified block letter, and there's an example of a modified block letter on page 101, and also it talks about a little bit on page 99. But with a modified block letter, there are certain parts, certain sections of the letter that must be aligned to the center. Okay, so not everything will be on that left margin. Some things have to be in the center. And with the full block letter format, if we turn to page 101, we will see that, for example, 7239 East Daphne Street, Mobile, Alabama, and then that zip code, as well as the date line, those things at the top of the letter are centered. And then at the bottom, your complimentary close, sincerely yours, the signature, and then the type name, those things are also aligned to the center margin. And so with the modified block letter format, you have to remember which sections are aligned center, okay, in order for that letter to be accurate. But again, we're using full block format. That's the only one we're going to use. We'll look at the third option just so that you're aware of it. The semi-block format letter, and an example of that, where it talks about it on page 101, the semi-block format is just like the modified block format letter that we just looked at, but with the semi-block format, you do indent the paragraphs, okay? So with the modified block format, everything is still aligned to the left margin except for those sections that we mentioned, right? The heading, the date line, the complimentary close, and then the type name at the bottom, that signature at the bottom. That's modified block. With semi-block format, you still want to have most things aligned to the left margin, but you want to make sure that you are indenting your paragraphs. Okay, so it's just like modified block, but you're indenting the paragraphs. But again, in this class, we will use full block format for letter correspondence assignments. It just makes our lives easier, right? And we want to do that. We want to make our lives easier. And so that is what you want to know about letter format. So regardless of what letter you write for me, make sure that you're using full block format. And again, you can refer to pages 99, 100, or 103 if you need a little bit more guidance with that. So let's talk about the parts of a letter. It is very important that you understand and use all of the appropriate parts of a letter. Your credibility is at risk if you do not include a part of a letter that should be a part of it. Okay? If it's expected for it to be there in the workplace, it should be there. Most times you don't get applause when you write the letter correctly, but people will notice if it's not correct. And so it's very important that you understand the parts of a letter and how they function within that overall letter document. So we start off with the heading, okay? And so your heading should contain your return address only. Only your return address. Now, let's go back to page 101. And we're looking at the modified block letter format, but we're just looking for the purposes of the heading. Okay, so go back to page 101, and do we see at the very top it has 7239 East Daphne Street, Mobile, Alabama 36608, that zip code, right? That is what we consider to be the heading. The heading is your return address only. This section should not include your name. It should not include your email address. It should not include your phone number. It should not include any other information other than your return address. Now, if you are writing a letter as a member of a company and you are using company letterhead, then you do not need to use a separate heading, okay? Because if we look back at page 100, right, we see that that letterhead provides us with the company contact information. So there is then no need for you to go back and put a separate return address there. Does that make sense? And so when you're writing a letter, it's coming from you. It's not coming from a company or a business and there's no letterhead. Then you just want to include a heading that would only contain your return address. Got it? Good. And so the next part of the letter is the date line. You want to use a standard month, a numeric date, and a numeric year format. And so, for example, June 1, 2017. That would be a correct date line. You don't want to say 6/1/17. That's not formal enough, right? We want to make sure that we write out the month and that we include the numeric date, the comma after the date, and then the year, okay? The full year. And so don't put your comma in the wrong place. Make sure your comma goes after the date, okay? Next, we have the inside address. The inside address is really important because this is now the recipient's information. And so you want to make sure that you include as much information as you can in that inside address. If you have the recipient's name and title, you want to include that, and definitely the company's name and address. Okay? And so you want to put all of that in the recipient's in the inside address, which is the recipient section. So if we look back at page 100 and we look at the inside address in this example, it starts with Miss Molly Garopoulos, CPA, right? That's her name. And then and her designation is CPA. Underneath that, we have her title as business manager. Okay, you see that? Underneath that, we have Myers Incorporated. And then underneath that, those last two lines, we have the address. That is what we would consider to be a complete inside address. But let's say you are doing a jobs packet assignment, which we'll talk about later this semester. And let's say you don't know a person's name. Let's say you search for a job and there's no contact person listed and you don't have a name, but you know that you want to send a letter to this company or address a letter to this specific company for a job that you're interested in. Okay? One thing that you can do is to address it to the position title, right? Or as much information as you have about the position title. So let's just say for a quick second that you have a job that you're interested in and you want to send a cover letter, which we'll talk about later, and you want to apply for that job, okay? But you don't have a name of an individual. You could, instead of putting the, there's nothing there to put for the name, but where it says Molly Garopoulos, business manager, instead of all of that, you could just put human resources director, for example, or hiring manager. And we'll review this again when we talk about the jobs packet assignment. But since we're talking about inside addresses, you want it to be as complete as possible. But when you don't have all the information like the person's name, you can just put the title or the position that you would want this letter to go to. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. But if you have questions about that, please let me know. Next we have the salutation, and that's your greeting. And you never just want to use the recipient's first name. Okay, you want to remain formal in tone. You want to say, Dear Miss Doe, Dear Mr. Johnson, or if you're not sure if the person is male or female, you want to say, Dear Lindsay Wright, for example, include their first and last name. Now, you never want to assume that you know if someone is male or female just based on the sound of their name, okay? Because so many names can be male or female. For example, Lindsay can be male or female. Kelly can be male or female. Dana can be male or female. There's so many names that can be male or female names. And so if you're not entirely sure, err on the side of putting dear and then their full name, okay, in that salutation. Now the body of the letter. This is where you actually write the letter. Now I don't want you to get confused because in terms of the parts of a letter, this section is called the body of the letter, okay? But within the body of the letter section, you want to use ABC format, which is of course abstract body conclusion. So you want to create paragraphs that follow the abstract body and conclusion format. Okay? Again, ABC format is how we structure our communication. And you want to include the 5 W's as needed, depending on the type of letter you're writing. If you're writing a good news letter, chances are you may need to include that who, what, where, when, and why, those 5 W's, okay? If you're writing a bad news letter, depending on the scenario, you may not need to include that information up front like that. But just, you'll have to determine based on the scenario you're given for your assignment what you're having to do and which is going to work best. Think about your audience. Will your audience benefit from knowing those important details? Or is there other information that the audience needs first? Okay? And so complimentary close, of course you want to be professional and you want to make sure that you're using the closing that is accepted in the workplace, such as sincerely, respectfully, or best regards. You never want to be too informal, right? For example, this is a weird example, but you don't want to sign your letter with love always or yours truly. Things like that could be a little bit too blurred in terms of its intention. So we want to just stay on the side of sincerely or respectfully or best regards. These are accepted as good complimentary closes. And then after the complimentary close, remember you want to return 4 times, and this is where you get to your signature, okay, that section called the signature. And so that is your type name. After you return 4 times, you want to put your type name there. But there is that space, that 4 spaces that you just made is where you can include your signed name. Traditionally, when a letter was created, that space was left there so a person could sign their name, physically sign their name. Since so much of our communication is electronic, nowadays you can create an electronic signature that you can make it to a JPEG file, like an image file, and then you can just stick it into your letters. Or you can use a cursive font to sign your name, to make it look like it's kind of a scripted font. You could do that as well. Now, I don't suggest creating digital signatures because they can so easily be lifted from your document and applied to other things that you may not have knowledge of. Unfortunately, we live in a society where information is hacked all the time, and you'd hate for your signature to just be floating out there. Okay, so I don't recommend those. If you leave that section blank, those 4 lines blank, and then you just type your name at the bottom, that's perfectly fine. And so next we have the enclosure line and then the copy notation. And both of these you would include as needed. Okay, these are not a part of every single letter. And so the enclosure line is like an attachment in an email. You're essentially saying that there are other documents enclosed within this packet and you want your reader to be aware of that. The copy notation is when you would say that I'm carbon copying this letter to someone else. It's like that CC designation that you'll see in an email. You're sending this to the intended recipient, but somebody else is also getting a copy of it. Okay? And again, you use these last 2 as needed. But your heading, unless there's a letterhead, your date line, your inside address, salutation, the body of the letter, the complimentary close, and the signature are all expected to be a part of your standard business letter. So let's talk about the appearance of your letter. It's really, really important that you think about how your letter looks, okay? The appearance of the work that you create matters, and your credibility can easily be diminished if your work doesn't look good, if it doesn't look professional. or if it looks sloppy or overcrowded. Okay? And so you want to be mindful of that. As a professional or a technical communicator, you want to make sure that you are creating good quality work that looks good. And so you want to consider things like printer quality. If you have a printer that smudges the documents you create and the ink is just kind of smudged all over the page because maybe it's low on toner or something's wrong with it, you want to find another printer, right? You don't ever want to just let that go and send out a letter that is smudged or of poor quality. You want to consider the fonts that you use. Use a standard font that would look good in a business letter. Never use something that is a decorative font, something that denotes humor or is overly elegant and looks like it should belong on a wedding invitation. Nothing that's too fancy or frilly or just inappropriate for the workplace. So use something that's standard. These fonts tend to include Helvetica, Calibri, Times New Roman, Arial. Those are some of the standard fonts. Okay, and so choose a font that's standard, and usually 11 or 12 point size font is acceptable for most body text, most general text in a letter. Okay? Spacing and margins. We talked about spacing for the full block format letter on page 100, and we want to follow those guidelines. But then we also want to consider our margins. Okay, so you don't want your letter to start too far in the middle of your document, and you don't want it to end too soon either. So typically 1-inch margins all the way around your letter is ideal. Okay, most times when you open up a Word document, it will already have those margins set for you. So barring any changes that you may have made, you should be able to work with the margins that are already in place in your Word document. You want to be mindful of overcrowding of text with the appearance of your letter. And so that means you just have way too many words on the page, right? We want to be concise. We want to keep things short and simple, remember? And so we don't want to overcrowd our pages with text. You want to make sure that you're going back through your writing as a part of that writing process. And when you revise, that you're taking out phrases and words that you don't necessarily need. Maybe it's something you said already. Maybe you're being redundant. And maybe you can eliminate some words. Maybe you can tighten your wording a little bit. That's going to be key in workplace writing, okay? Because it's going to be important that you respond to what your audience needs. And they're usually, what? Impatient to find important information. And they're very busy among other things. And so you want to make sure that your text is not going to turn them away. And typically when people see a whole lot of words on a page, they tend to shy away from it, right? So if you have really thick paragraphs, break those paragraphs down into smaller paragraphs, okay? And again, eliminate words and sentences that you don't need. So when we say lopsided letters, what does that mean? Well, again, lopsided letters are letters that have too much white space. Okay, and so you may be writing a letter, but there's not a lot to say, and you may end up with more than half of your page being blank, right? There's just nothing there. That's what we would consider to be a lopsided letter. You have way more blank space on the page than you have text, and it looks lopsided. It looks like something is missing there, even if your communication is complete in that letter. One thing you can do to avoid lopsided letters is just to space down a couple of times before you begin your letter, so that your letter starts more near the middle of the page, not in the middle, but near, a little bit lower down, so that it's using more of the space of the page. Okay? Otherwise, it just looks odd, right? When you have your letter ending really early and there's nothing else at the bottom. Okay, so just be mindful of lopsided letters. And again, if I haven't said this already, this PowerPoint is just going through what you've already read in the book. Okay, so if you haven't done the readings yet and you're just depending on the PowerPoint, you may be a little bit lost. You need to make sure that you go back and do the readings and let the PowerPoint be a supplement, a lecture to help you make sure that you understand what the concepts are in the book. Okay, so reading becomes paramount. Now, we talk about making a good impression on your reader. And you always want to be mindful of your style and tone. and you want your readers to see you as a courteous, well-informed professional. Okay? And so the book talks about something called you attitude. Now, this is a complicated concept to explain, but it's pretty simple. You want to make sure that you are not writing in such a way that you are not considering what your audience needs. Okay? So if we turn to page 111, for example, you'll see near the bottom middle of the page, it has a section there that says an I-centered draft. Hopefully you've read that already. And you'll notice that in that example, most of the writing starts with the letter I, right? And it's I think, right? Our firm, we have found. It's very much from an I focus. In other words, it makes you feel as if the writer is just talking about him or herself. They're not actually intending to communicate to you about anything. They just are talking about themselves. That is incorrect. With you attitude, what we're trying to do is use our style and our tone in such a way that the reader feels like we mean to engage with them. We want to talk to them, right? And we're communicating to them and to their needs. This is one of those things that you will have to take inventory of your own writing. Again, in that revision process of the writing process, you can start to see if you're using I too much or maybe we too much, and instead you just want to turn it around so that your attitude is focused on what you being your audience needs. Okay? And if you need my help with that, remember, you can write a draft of your assignment before it's due and come to my office hours or contact me during office hours, and I would be happy to go over it with you to help point those things out. But you would, of course, want to get it done ahead of time, okay? Ahead of the deadline. And so those are some examples there, but we want to make sure that we are mindful of making a good impression on our reader through our style and our tone. So the book talks about 5 common types of business letters, and I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but you definitely want to make sure that you've read through these in the book and that you understand the different types. Some of these can be blurred. So for sometimes an inquiry letter, right, when you're requesting information, can seem very much like a special request letter, right? But they do serve different purposes at times. And so we just want to make sure that we're mindful of the different types of letters. In our upcoming assignments, we will be writing an inquiry letter and we will be writing a customer relations letter. Okay, at least those 2 letters. And later, with our jobs packet assignment, we will be writing a cover letter. So you definitely want to complete the readings on the different types of letters. Now, it is important to understand when we should be direct in our communication and when we should be indirect. Believe it or not, sometimes you as the informed communicator will need to soften the blow for your audience. Okay? It's not going to work if you're always direct with them. And sometimes we tend to be people who don't like to beat around the bush, just get to the point. Well, in the workplace, you deal with a lot of different types of personalities and a lot of different types of people. And it is just best practice for you to know when to be direct and when to be indirect. So, when we have to send a good news message, like a good news letter, you want to use a direct approach. That's direct communication. And what that means is you want to put the good news at the beginning of your letter in that abstract paragraph. You want to begin by putting your reader in the right frame of mind, letting them know that you have good news to share. Okay, why wait, right? If you have good news, go ahead and share it. But if it's bad news communication and you have bad news to report, do not begin your letter with the bad news. You want to be indirect. Think about it as a sandwich. If the abstract paragraph is your top bun, the conclusion paragraph is your bottom bun, and the meat in the middle is your body, okay? Then you want to make sure that you sandwich the bad news in that middle part, in the body section. Okay? You never want to begin with it. You never want to end with it. Okay? You want to find a way in that abstract paragraph to open in a manner that is professional and pleasant. Okay? But then you want to put the bad news in the middle, and then you want to end with as much goodwill as you can. Now, here's what you don't want to do. I don't want you to get confused and think that my abstract paragraph has to be good news, right? It has to sound really, really upbeat and good. And then my body paragraph is me dropping the hammer on them, and it's the bad news. And then I have to be really, really, really good and happy and positive again. Your letter should have the same tone, the same mood throughout, but you actually deliver the bad news in the body paragraph. Okay? And so you can take a sentence or two, probably 2 or 3 sentences for that abstract paragraph, just to kind of walk your reader into what it is you're going to be talking about. And then in the body paragraph, then you tell them the bad news, and you can explain, offer a little bit more of an explanation. And then your conclusion paragraph, you find a goodwill closing, a way to try to end it in the best possible manner. Okay, this is not easy to do. And again, if you want to talk with me about some of your ideas for any upcoming assignments, please let me know. Just work on it a little bit ahead of the deadline and contact me, and I'll be happy to look over it with you and give you some pointers and some tips. Now, there are some examples on page 120 and 121 with regards to ways to write an effective and an ineffective bad news letter. Okay, but the book also gives us information on ways to say no diplomatically. This is really useful when you're writing bad news, so make sure that you take a look at this information. Okay, and so it starts on page 130. A good way to begin when you have to deliver bad news is to thank your customer for writing, or thank your audience for something. Find some way to thank them. Thank you very much for your letter, sharing your concerns. Thank you very much for your continued time and service. Whatever, whatever the case might be. Find something to thank them for. Then, in that same paragraph, you can state the problem to reassure the customer or the reader that you understand the complaint or you understand the issue. That can be a part of your abstract. Now, in that body paragraph, you can explain what happened with the product or service or issue before you give the decision. But when you do give your decision, you want to give it without hedging. You don't want there to be any gray area, and you don't want to apologize for your decision if you're not at fault. Okay, if you or your company are not at fault, you could feel terrible about the decision you have to give, but it doesn't mean that you have to issue an apology. Remember, letters can be official legal documents. Okay, and it's very possible that someone could take an apology from you, especially on behalf of a company, as an admission of guilt. If your company is not at fault, then you are not required to apologize. Okay? However, if your company has made a mistake, then by all means, right, make sure that your apology is known. And then you want to leave the door open for better and continued business. So that again would be like your conclusion paragraph with that goodwill closing. Okay? And so these guidelines for saying no should be really helpful, especially when you're writing a bad news letter. Okay? And so hopefully these slides have been helpful for you, and just walking through that beginning part of the chapter, of chapter 4, specifically with preparing correspondence that are letters. Okay, the chapter includes a whole lot more. We're just focused on the letters portion right now because we have letter assignments coming up. And so again, if you have any questions or if you would like to talk with me about your assignment, maybe do a draft of it and contact me during office hours, either by phone or in person, for us to go over it, I would be more than happy to do that. Okay? Thanks so much. If you have questions, let me know.